what makes a signifier work, part of what makes a signifier operate, is that we never fully, absolutely, completely know what is being signified. Why do I ask this question? Well, one of the reasons I'm asking this question is that we're returning to the question of the name of the father in Lacan's work, and where we left off, we were trying to explain maybe some of the limitations of this reference to the name of the father as a signifier, but also trying to expand upon why indeed the role of the name of the father as a signifier is important. And you'll see, I've noted up here, you can't definitively pinpoint this name of the father signifier. You can't pinpoint it once and for all, know what it is. It wouldn't work if that was the case. In other words, another way of putting that is that the basic anchoring of the name of the father remains at some level unconscious. And the fact that it remains unconscious is also, you could say, what keeps it going, what keeps it anchored, what keeps the processes related to it operating. I promised last time to give a couple of quotes from Lacan. We did one. We spoke about the dead father. We spoke about why the function of the father, or the question, what is a father, in Freud's work, should be related to the notion of the dead father. In a brief set of talks that have been published recently under the title On the Names of the Father, there's a couple of interesting notes that I wanted to bring out. A couple of comments that Lacan makes in these lectures. And just to state the obvious, some people will already know this, but at the time, I think it's around 62, maybe 63, when Lacan is supposed to deliver a years-long seminar on the topic of the name of the father. Maybe it's the names of the father. That's the same year that his seminar is interrupted because he's excommunicated as a training analyst from the International Psychoanalytic Association, and he goes on to instead deliver the 4 fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis. If I was a little wicked, I'd be tempted to ask, yeah, what's that about? Is there a question mark? Do you keep us guessing what the name of the father is? Anyways, here are 2 little reference points. Number 1, in this text, Lacan says, symbols are not elaborations of sensations or of reality. What is properly symbolic, and the most primitive of symbols, introduces something else, something different into human reality. He says, the creation of symbols accomplishes the introduction of a new reality. That point seems to me really crucial, because as we'll start to see, and I think it really points again to the operation of this name of the father, that for Lacan there can be signifying elements, symbolic elements, which bring with them the possibility of reorganizing facets of our world. Let's just reiterate that. Symbolic elements, mythical elements, fictional elements. Let's stay with myth for a moment. Mythical elements which can reorganize our world. Let's develop that. That cannot just reorganize our world, but that can allocate roles, that can impose laws, that can give identities. Symbols or myths have that propensity anthropologically, and we will come to that when we look at Freud's totem and taboo, which you could even say is a kind of extended meditation on precisely how that may happen. So let's keep that in mind. You may remember in some previous lectures I've also spoken briefly about Claude Lévi-Strauss's notion of symbolic efficacity, trying to stress the agency of the symbolic, the agency of signifiers, and that point once again, mythical, symbolic elements can help us restructure, reorganize our reality. That's very much a part of what we're talking about. Second reference, also within this slim little volume on the names of the father, mythically, Lacan says, the father can only be an animal. Then he goes on to say, he says he's highly indebted to Lévi-Strauss's structural critique of myths, and he says, it is necessary to place after the totem, at the level of the father, a second term, the function of proper names. So, what we've seen here, mythical elements, symbolic elements can restructure, can reorganize reality, number 1. Number 2, the father might be one of those terms. Mythically, the father is an animal. What could we have in mind with that? Mythically, the father must be an animal, and it seems to be accompanied by the use of the proper name. Right, so we'll keep those in play. Let's now move, before we do our little bit of Freud scholarship, let's link back to some of the dilemmas and crises that we spoke about when we were thinking about foreclosure. And let's try to get a good sense of what, once this apparent, maybe this is Lacan's own myth of psychical structure, once this apparent operation of the naming, locating, anchoring operation of the name of the father, what it enables us to do. So if you look up here, I've got links back to foreclosure. And I've tried to stress a couple of times in those lectures, and again now, that most fundamentally what we're interested in here is a kind of location or an anchoring. I've used the anchoring terminology quite a lot, but we could also say that what the name of the father does is it gives a name, by which we don't just mean Derek, although, that's significant, and indeed a surname, which places me in a symbolic generational heritage. It places me within a genealogy. But maybe more significantly, to be named also means how I'm precisely located in a symbolic realm with brothers, sisters, uncles, a kinship, but it gives me a location. And in not only that location, that symbolic role that I'm born into, it also gives me a sense of how I will relate to those around me and what are some of the regulations and rules which come into play for how I should relate to those people around me. Another way of thinking about this is to say that the name of the father, this naming, anchoring, locating function, is one which in a sense, to risk being somewhat dramatic here, rescues me from the imaginary. The imaginary domain, as we've seen, is a domain of rivalrous relationship with others who I see myself as and who seem to threaten me. Also, remember, mirror, mirror on the wall, there are also loving relationships. So you've got, within the imaginary, a certain number of resources to think about the relationship to others. But that's a very limited resource. Others are my rivals. Others are stand-ins for me who might eradicate me. Others are those who narcissistically show back some loved image, ideal image of myself. So you do have a very limited repertoire of how to relate to others, but it's not one that enables you to have a kind of social anchoring. It's me versus them, me versus one against the other, a kind of dyadic relationship which oscillates between loving and hating. If we manage to do this thing, where we're located in the symbolic, it means that a whole series of different roles starts to become possible, and it means that the big other that we've spoke about in previous lectures starts to operate. But I just want to emphasize again, you could say that being located in the symbolic rescues us from this domain of rivalry, from the imaginary. This domain of rivalry, the paranoid relationship with others, one-to-one conflicts, is enabled by what I've called a radar of desire. I want to give a brief clinical vignette, a fictional vignette, but what I'm trying to suggest here is that, okay, the person is a psychotic subject who's been working clinically for quite some time. The problem that they have again and again and again is that the relationships don't really work out. They'll have a relationship with someone who's going to take on a role, let's say, of a mentor or a teacher. It starts off well, and then initially there's this sense that, oh, the person really loves me, the person respects me, the person admires me. In other words, we're kind of located within the ideal ego reflection of the mirror stage imaginary dimension. But then often things will flip, and then suddenly the person becomes threatening. And the psychotic subject is perceiving the person as wanting to do something horrible to them. What am I trying to suggest here? I'm trying to suggest that in the absence of the name of the father, or in the absence of what I've called the radar of desire, the relationship to other people in certain states of psychosis is almost confined, depending of course on the subject, to those oscillating relationships. If they love me, they respect me, they admire me, they want to be me, or they want to be me, they want to take my place. I'm paranoid about what their intentions are. Or to reformulate again, if there is no name of the father, the desire of others can be a very paranoia-inducing thing, because I've got no educated guess as to what they may want, or the only guess I can make is within the parameters of what I've called the repertoire of relationships that come within the imaginary. They love me, they admire me, they want to take my place, they want to eradicate me, they want to get rid of me. So this is not really necessarily a very comfortable way of being. The radar of desire, as I'm calling it, is Something which means that I can make an educated guess about what I think others might possibly desire about me, what they might possibly desire. It gives me some general anchoring and some social conventions and understandings, values within the big other, that help domesticate my experience, my psychical experience. We could make that as an experiment then. Imagine that I don't have what I'm calling the radar of desire, my educated guesses. Of course, they're not completely conscious, so they're not really guesses, but what makes other people tick, what they want from me. If I don't have that, it's easy to see how my default option is they love me or I'm paranoid because they want to do something problematic to me. And let me reiterate again, at least in one clinical example, that was, I think, exactly the struggle that the psychotic subject was battling with. Many lectures ago, I gave this brief example of How to Look Good Naked, British TV show, reality TV show, where you have a makeover, you're obviously not all that happy with how you're looking, so you go to the show, they show you how to look good naked with the influence of a hairdresser and all these other people. At the end of the day, you get to put your naked image, it's not really, it's semi-naked, whatever, and you're artfully obscured. But you put that in a public place. And of course, I love this because it gives you an example of how one's own image and your relationship to your own bodily image, as private and personal as that may seem to be to you, is also always filtered through what the big other thinks you should look like, and the values and ideals that are stored or located or produced, re-engendered time and time again by this postulate that there's a big other. Now let's imagine you've been invited to How to Look Good Naked, but the name of the father hasn't kind of taken. There hasn't been this installation of a location in the symbolic order for you, which also means that the big other isn't really properly operating. Now imagine your dilemma. How to look good naked. My radar of desire doesn't work so well. So my relationship to my mirror image is like, okay. And indeed, my relationship, what do I think others will think makes me look good naked? There is no answer. Because my radar of desire, my conventionalized assumptions of what the big other thinks is desirable don't operate. So in this little example, what I'm trying to accentuate is that those two questions, what does the big other think looks good naked for me, that doesn't work. I don't know what looks good naked for me. I can make some guesses by looking at what I see on TV, but it's not installed in a kind of common sense way. And secondly, not only am I not able to get a sense of what other people think looks good naked, or what other people generally would think makes me look good naked, you could also say that my own image isn't properly anchored, because how I understand my own image can't make reference again back to this big other, this set of conventionalized norms. So again, what I'm trying to stress is that without this radar of desire, this anchoring of the name of the father, a whole series of relationships, not just to other people and to the domain of the big other, meaning what should I do with my life? What job should I take? What's important? What do other people find valuable in me? But also my relationship to my own image. Who am I? Those things are kind of not able to operate. We're not able to provide, as it were, what I've called common sense installed understandings, reasons. So this is one reason that you could say that the installation of the name of the father is a kind of domesticating. Some theorists even go so far as to say that it's pacifying. It means that you've got a set of resources, you've got that as it were, internalized understanding of social norms, values, conventions that the psychotic subject may not have. It domesticates your relationship to others who don't seem to necessarily always be threatening. You don't have to relate to them simply through the paradigm of the mirror stage. Others and the desire of others thus becomes less frightening. They can be linked to a prospective set of meanings. And again, I've just thrown in this tricky and often confusing Lacanian terminology here, just so we can try and explain it. Once the name of the father operates, then so does phallic signification. What is phallic signification? There's a lot of easier ways of trying to explain it. For me, phallic signification means an ability to grasp or to think or to hypothesize what other people desire. And if I've got that, it makes engaging with others and thinking about myself and various other things a lot less intimidating. Here, phallic signification is more, you could say, the significations of desire. Let's then start to come to a conclusion by making a really important conceptual refinement. We've spoken a lot about what the big other is in previous lectures. There's different ways that people want to understand it, the particularization of the symbolic order for a given subject. There's Dylan Evans, for example. We've said it's the locus of authority, the locus of truth. We've said it's the battery, the collection of signifiers, all of these different types of things. But you could say that the big other is, as it were, how the subject dialogues and tries to understand these and find some kind of meanings and location with reference to the conventionalized norms and understandings of a given society. Remember, we also spoke about the big other as the rules of the game. We've tried to suggest here that not having access to that is part of what it would mean to have the foreclosure of the name of the Father. Let us now try to pinpoint something. If the name of the Father isn't there, the role of the big other is a lot more amorphous. And you could say we have a kind of, almost like a spectrum within psychosis. On the one hand, if the big other's not operating at all, then whenever, and I've alluded a little bit to this, if the big other's not operating at all, then my compass of social meanings and values and understandings of other people is not there. Other people are opaque, and the desire of other people is opaque, which can be a frightening situation. Maybe the extreme within, if we're imagining, and I'm not saying this is the best way of doing things, but just for the purposes of the example, if we imagine there's a spectrum of different types of psychosis, maybe we could say that catatonia is one where the dimension of the big other is completely inoperative. Importantly also, if the big other is completely inoperative, then language ain't going to work so well, because language itself requires a certain anchoring. It requires a certain type of anchoring so that I can use signifiers with a sense of what they might mean relative to other signifiers and how they're understood within the social realm. In other words, what do these words seem to mean to the big other? The big other's not operating, language ain't going to work so well, which is not to say that the psychotic subject doesn't have language, but language is perhaps, there are going to be, let's put it that way, there are going to be some potential disturbances and erratic qualities to their language. On the other end of this imagined spectrum that we're talking about, what if the big other becomes all too close, too personified, suffocatingly overbearing, capricious? In those instances, the big other is the kind of angry, persecutory presence that is always out to get me. And in that respect, you could say, once again, one doesn't have that comfortable mediated distance to the big other. Rather, the big other is overbearing. The big other is too controlling, too close to me. And as you can guess, that would be one way of thinking about paranoia. So it helps here to conclude with 2 points. Of the many different operations and, as it were, psychological abilities and operations that are enabled by the installation of this operation, this name of the Father, this anchoring in the symbolic. Of those many operations, one of the most crucial is how one can find a comfortable mediated space between me and the big other. That location of social conventions, norms, understandings, meanings, so on and so forth. If the big other is completely inoperative, which is one possibility in terms of the foreclosure of the name of the Father, if that big other is not operative, then words, meanings, values, social understandings are very difficult to grasp. I'm not saying impossible, but not really difficult. On the other hand, if the big other is overly personified, is made larger than life, a kind of primal father figure, if we make a little bit of reference to Freud's totem and taboo, then the big other is this kind of traumatic too closeness, overbearing presence, which is one way of thinking about paranoia. You could then say that for something akin to the neurotic subject, and I'm trying really hard to avoid the kind of all of these value judgments seem to accrue to these distinctions, which theoretically, at least, we should do our best to put to one side. It's not a kind of evaluation game. Nevertheless, you could say that for the neurotic subject, when the name of the Father works, yes, the big other operates. One does have an installed sense of social values and understandings and norms and how one can locate oneself with relationship to what I've called the radar of desire. That means that the relationship to the big other is mediated. The name of the Father, in other words, mediates the other. We need to keep this big other at arm's length, neither too close nor so far away that it is totally inoperative. So in optimal conditions, the name of the Father has operated, the big other is installed, and I have a way of engaging with my fellow subjects that isn't terrifying, that gives me a kind of operational best educated guess as to how desire is functioning in this situation, what is considered desirable, what's considered valuable in the social situation. I'm able to anchor my identity. I'm able to give some definition to where my role is, how I relate to others, what I think of myself. It's never going to be completely clear, of course, because there's an unconscious, but it gives me a sense of security. It gives me a sense of location. It gives me a sense of identity.